At least 5 U.S. police officers have been hit by gunfire as protests over the death of George Floyd continue across the country. U.S. President Donald Trump has threatened to deploy the military to crack down on the rioting and looting, which he has labelled acts of domestic terror.
After being criticized for remaining silent on the protests engulfing U.S. cities, President Donald Trump struck a harsh tone from the White House's Rose Garden. He's vowed to send in thousands of troops to regain control of the situation.
Mayors and governors must establish an overwhelming law enforcement presence until the violence has been quelled. If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
While the president spoke, police used tear gas and rubber bullets to clear protesters just outside the White House so that Mr. Trump could walk out to the historic St. John's Church not far away. He stood with a Bible outside the church in what has been widely criticized as a photo op during a time of crisis. The brutal death of George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer has triggered outrage across the United States for a week now. Protests usually begin peacefully in the daytime, with violence erupting towards the end of the day. From Los Angeles to New York City, thousands have clashed with police. Widespread looting has also been reported.
I think we all share the same sentiment. We want our city back, and we want justice for George Floyd, and that is at the top of our list of things. And a lot of us are willing to risk our lives to make that happen. But in a peaceful way is the way to do it.
We need a new law passed. We want justice. We want the police to obviously pay for their sins for what they committed, this monstrosity over here.
Floyd's death was caught on video, showing policeman Derek Chauvin pinning him down with his knee for nearly 9 minutes. The official autopsy report has labelled the death homicide by neck compression.
Simon Marks, following the developments in Washington, D.C. He joins us now. Simon, we're seeing reports of police officers being shot at and protesters seriously hurt. How are things looking? Are they looking like they're escalating?
It's difficult to know, Glenda. I mean, certainly last night was a very difficult night in towns and cities all over the United States. In Minneapolis, where all this began 8 days ago with the killing of George Floyd, 4 Minneapolis police officers were shot and wounded. The chief of police breaking down in tears as he announced that news to reporters in that city. There was widespread looting in the center of Manhattan last night in New York City. There was widespread looting in Los Angeles last night. Here in Washington, D.C., a vast military police operation to try and lock the city down in one neighborhood of the city, not far from the White House. Some of those protesters who were tear-gassed were chased into the neighborhood by military police who wanted to arrest them, at which point local residents all took the protesters into their homes, and at least 100 of them are reportedly still in those houses this morning, with police outside saying that if they leave, they won't be arrested, but the protesters don't quite yet seem to believe that. So what happens when night falls here this evening, I think, is another big question. And the overriding question is just how ready is President Trump truly to deploy the U.S. military to cities all over the country? Last night we saw the use of tear gas in Lafayette Park directly opposite the White House, but it then became clear very rapidly thereafter that that was largely about creating a path so that the president and some of his top aides could visit the historic church, St. John's, that had been damaged the night before in a fire just opposite the White House. Was that simply a military move to create a photo opportunity for the president, or was it the opening salvo in military action that could be seen all over the United States unless the looting ends and unless the confrontations with police by protesters come to an end? We simply do not at this stage know.
Simon, the president has been using some very strong language. He's even called himself the president of law and order. What's been the reaction to Mr. Trump's threat as you mentioned, to use troops to end the unrest?
Well, look, I mean, Donald Trump's appearance last night was very carefully orchestrated and calibrated by the White House. There were references during his speech to America's Second Amendment. That's the Second Amendment that guarantees Americans the right to bear guns, a matter that is of tremendous importance to his core supporters. He then walked over to the church holding that Bible. The bishop of Washington's Episcopal Diocese says she is furious that her church was used by the president as what she describes as a prop, and she has completely distanced herself from what he did there last night. But that use of the Bible, again, is designed to reach out to Donald Trump's core supporters, Christian evangelical conservatives all over the country, who in very large measure do not want to see, like many other Americans, towns and cities destabilized by looting, and are willing to support the concept of a muscular military response to put those protests down, even when, as we saw last night in Lafayette Park, those protests are peaceful and therefore constitutionally protected by the rules of the road. Democrats, of course, are outraged by what the president has done. You would expect them to be. But there are also voices of criticism coming from within the Republican Party. The governor of Massachusetts, a Republican, last night broke down at a podium as he told supporters of his that what the country needed to hear last night was a message of compassion from the President of the United States. And he argues the country didn't hear it.
Troubling times ahead. Thanks very much for that update. Simon Mark speaking to us from Washington, D.C.